Hello, McFluffy52 here, and today I want to give you a Magic Timmy's Praetor rankings. We got a whole new set of Praetors in March of Machines, and I want to give you my take on where they stack up, how they stack up against each other, and how playable they might be in Standard. So, this is the rankings. I have Sheoldred in first, Elesh Norn second, Vorinclex third, Urabrask fourth, and Jin-Gitaxias fifth. Now let's go ahead and talk about each card and why I put them there. So Sheoldred, I think Sheoldred is quite strong, mainly because it has an ETB. I think Elesh Norn is a very strong second, but I think Sheoldred might be a bit more playable purely because when it enters the battlefield, the opponent is forced to sacrifice a non-token creature or planeswalker. So it hits both creatures and planeswalkers. It also has Menace and is a 4/5, so you're removing a blocker while also being able to potentially cut your way through because it has Menace. So if they have two creatures now, they're down to one, they can't actually block Sheoldred, you still get in damage. And then Sheoldred, you pay 5, exile Sheoldred, then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. Activate only as a sorcery and only if the opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. Looking at the rest of the March of Machines set, I think this card is actually not impossible to flip. I think there are a few cards that are pretty good that mill you and your opponent that you can play in a Sheoldred dedicated deck. Say you play Invasion of Amonkhet, it mills you and your opponent 3 cards, they discard a card, or discard 2 cards, I forget what it is exactly, and then you draw a card. So this is a good way to fill the graveyard, and you're naturally going to also be filling the opponent's graveyard by removing their creatures. Sheoldred gets an extra card in the graveyard when it enters the battlefield because they sacrifice a creature. So I don't think it's impossible to flip Sheoldred. And then in the back of the Sheoldred's enchantment saga, the True Scriptures, I think is actually quite good. Now the first 2 chapters are sort of lackluster. The first chapter is for each opponent destroy up to 1 target creature and a or planeswalker that player controls. So you get to pick your opponent's creature or planeswalker they control and just get rid of it. Now, the second chapter is each opponent discards 3 cards and then mill 3 cards. So this, again, helping to fill those graveyards because the last chapter is where it is all at. This is where the money is. Put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control, exile the True Scriptures, and then return it to the battlefield. So it's important to note that with all these Praetors, they flip back onto their front side on their third chapter. So this means you get any sort of ETB again, so you get Sheoldred's ETB as well as all the creatures that are in the graveyard, which should be quite a bit. This is basically Rise of the Dark Realms on the last chapter of Sheoldred, and it should most of the time win you the game because there should be a bunch of awesome creatures in the graveyard that you just spent filling up. So I think Sheoldred is really strong for that reason. Now moving on to Elesh Norn, it is 4 mana for a 3/5 with Vigilance. Now, whenever a source an opponent controls deals damage to you or a permanent you control, that source's controller loses 2 life unless they pay 1. So it is a sort of a taxing effect whenever the opponent deals damage to Elesh Norn or any of your other creatures. Now with Elesh Norn, you're going to want to go wide because of the next ability, or how you flip Elesh Norn, is you go ahead and pay 3, sacrifice 3 other creatures, so that's Elesh Norn's additional cost, and then you exile it, and return to the battlefield transformed. And you get the Argent Etchings. Now, the Argent Etchings is pretty good. It's up there with Sheoldred's saga as well as one of the best, I think. I think Jin's saga surprisingly might be one of the best because you just like fill your hand and then get to like put a bunch of things onto the battlefield. It's quite nutty, but I do think there is reason why Jin might not see any play in Standard. Now moving back to Elesh Norn, the first chapter here is incubate 2 5 times and then transform all incubator tokens you control. So this means you get 5 2/2s that are artifacts and Phyrexians. Now, the second chapter, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain double strike until end of turn. This turns your 5 2/2s into 3/3s with double strike. Now, if you're playing this in a Phyrexian deck, you're also going to have these creatures get other buffs from like Grafted Butcher, which is a Phyrexian lore that we're getting in this set. So your creature is going to be wailing in for a bunch of damage, and then the last chapter is kind of just extra. You basically destroy everything else on the battlefield besides artifacts, lands, Phyrexians, and of course the Argent Etchings. And then it goes ahead, flips back to Elesh Norn. You should still have all those creatures remaining, so if you really wanted to, you could go ahead and try and transform Elesh Norn again, if whatever you did was not enough. And that's of course if you get to keep the creatures. So I think Elesh Norn is quite strong. The static ability on the front side is very annoying because your opponent's not going to want to attack him. Elesh Norn has 5 toughness, so it's really hard to kill. Either they're going to pay the mana, or they're going to have to pay life, and if they pay life, and they're not getting in enough damage because Elesh Norn is sitting there as a blocker, then the opponent, or whoever's playing Elesh Norn, can then crack back in on the return swing and knock the opponent out. So it's very important that that tax either takes the opponent out of like their turn, or they lose 2 life for each permanent that they damage or damaging the opponent. So Elesh Norn's static is super fun, super strong, and I think CGB has mentioned that this is his top Praetor for the set. I do think it's good, but I think the problem is very easy to remove Elesh Norn. She doesn't do anything particularly strong just sitting on the battlefield. Yeah, she doesn't allow the opponent to attack in, essentially, at least profitably, very easily. But if the opponent top decks like a bomb to just go over the, like overwhelm the opponent, then this might be a problem. So like, say the opponent top decks like Nissa, -7, it doesn't matter if Elesh Norn triggers a bunch of time to make them lose 2 life because the opponent's probably dead. So it does slow down the board, and I think that is strong. The ability to sacrifice 3 other creatures, it is somewhat difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. So I think Elesh Norn stands as a very solid second or even first, but I'm going to say Sheoldred's better and more playable. I don't think Sheoldred's as strong as Elesh Norn. The ceiling is much higher for Elesh Norn, but I think Sheoldred is just more generically powerful. Enter the battlefield, opponent removes something. If they remove Sheoldred, well, at least you still got something out of it. Elesh Norn could be 4 mana, nothing happens, which is a bit of a problem. And then also sacrificing 3 other creatures could be potentially quite taxing, but mono white right now runs a bunch of just small creatures that they get value out of ETB, so it's not as much of a problem. Next up, Vorinclex. Vorinclex, 5 mana, 6/6, trample reach. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 2 forest cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle. It's important to note that it says forest cards and not basic forests. So you can go ahead and pick up triomes, or if you're in another format, you can pick up anything else. We're looking at these cards for standard. So in this case, most likely you're going to be picking up normal forests or triomes. So this, I think, makes a solid case for it in like 5-color, just good stuff or whatever, because then you can go ahead and like fix your mana or just keep doing things. Or you can cycle away these lands on your next turn, or if you have mana open, so that's all good. I think one thing important to note about the stats and the body that Vorinclex has is reach. I think people are going to realize that there's a lot of good flyers coming out of Martial Machines. For instance, Zephyr, I think it's Zephyr Sentinel. Let me quickly check the card name. It is a 4 mana Convoke creature with 3/5, or it's a 3/4 in vigilance with flying, and each creature that convokes it gets a flying counter on it. So they can potentially send their entire board flying. It's called Zephyr Singer. That's what the card is. So I think there's going to be a lot of flyers, and this reach is more relevant than you would think. So in that case, I really do think Vorinclex's stats and body is quite good. It is competing with things like Defiler Vigor, which is definitely has more like presence on the battlefield. It can be higher value because you start pumping up everything else. But Vorinclex can help you find 2 lands that can approach flipping Vorinclex, because Vorinclex is very nice because all you have to do is just pay a bunch of mana. So Vorinclex, to flip it, you pay 8 mana, exile it, return it as the Grand Evolution. Now, the Grand Evolution, I am a little worried about this saga because of the first chapter. The first chapter says mill 10 cards, put up to 2 creature cards from among the milled cards onto the battlefield. Now, Standard is quite grindy, so milling 10 cards might actually be relevant, funny enough. But the other part is you need to put enough good creatures into your deck that you can hit 2 really strong creatures with this. Because otherwise, if you just mill 10 and then you get 2 mana dorks, this first chapter is going to feel quite bad. Thankfully, the next chapter is pretty amazing. Distribute 7 +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control. This means you just pump the board to high heaven, and then the last chapter is where you get to have a ton of fun because until end of turn, creatures you control gain pay 1 generic. This creature fights target creature you don't control. And then you go ahead and flip the Grand Evolution back into Vorinclex. I think it's important to note here that I don't believe Vorinclex actually gets this whole fight ability, which is kind of sad and silly. But I do really like this backside because you get free creatures, which is always fun. You get a bunch of power, and then you can go ahead and fight and remove whatever the opponent is trying to preserve or just clear the way. So you go ahead and fight all their creatures. Well, now it doesn't matter if you're like Kogla and Yadaro doesn't have trample. You can just go ahead and swing through because you already cleared the battlefield. Now, I will say one card that I think this Vorinclex works really well with is Storm the Festival, because Storm the Festival, go ahead, you can look at the top 5 cards of your library, I believe it is, and then you put 2 permanents with mana value 5 or less onto the battlefield, so you go ahead and slam Vorinclex onto the battlefield, you tutor up 2 forests, and then Storm the Festival has flashback, so you can go ahead and play those lands out, and eventually flashback Storm the Festival, so tons of value there. And it's important to note, like those two cards work well together because then you're just getting more like card advantage, which is one of the problems with green in Standard right now. And that is one of the reasons why Vorinclex is sitting here at 3rd on the list, is because green is definitively probably the worst color in Standard right now. It's just doesn't necessarily compete as well as mono white, mono black, mono red, and mono blue. But hopefully, with the introduction of Vorinclex and some of the other cards in the set, we will get to see Vorinclex stomping its way through. And let's go ahead and talk about Urabrask. Now, Urabrask, I'm sad to say that I put it at 4 here. I think it's a super sweet card and has a lot of potential, but I think there's limitations to where it's going to be played. I do think it is good value in any sort of mono red deck, because it is 4 mana, 4/4 for First Strike. So the body here is pretty good. First Strike is a really nice ability because you just can trade with things, and then Urabrask never dies. You can trade up sometimes if they have like a 5/4 or something like that. For instance, I believe I believe it is Doomscar Warrior is a 5/4. Well, technically it's a 4/3 and it has backup 1. So that would be an example of a creature that this could trade with and trade up with. But yeah, First Strike, good ability. Whenever you cast your first instant or sorcery spell, Urabrask deals 1 damage to target opponent, add a red. Now this is where I think a lot of the fun is. This means you can just spam spells, you can spell sling, with things like maybe you play Ancestral Anger, Thrill Possibility, big scores, you keep drawing into more spells and keep pinging your opponent. This card is so cool because it's basically like Burgi, which would give you like mana whenever you played a spell. I believe the card's Burgi, God of Storytelling. And then it's also sort of like Grape Shot because whenever you cast something, you get an additional damage. So it's super fun in that regard. And then flipping Urabrask is super interesting because it's only 1 red, but the restriction is you need to have casted 3 or more instant and/or sorcery spells this turn, which seems kind of hard, but at the same time, if you're familiar with decks that play Arc like Phoenix, it's a little bit more achievable than you think. I think the real thing holding this card back is it's 4 mana, so if you want to spam a bunch of cheap spells, your hand is probably empty by the time you get to 4 mana, and then you might have a little bit of trouble flipping this card. But I think in mono red, it still can do some good things. There are spells that work with it, like Lightning Strike, Play with Fire, and the Festivities. That will all trigger Urabrask and help you keep up with mana. But yeah, when you flip Urabrask, you get the Great Work. And the Great Work says it does 3 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. So you get a sort of one-sided Anger of the Gods or Brotherhood's End. The second chapter is create 3 treasure tokens. These treasure tokens are actually kind of important because the third chapter says until end of turn you may cast instant and or sorcery spells from any graveyard. If a spell cast this way would be put into the graveyard, exile it instead, exile the Great Work, and then return it to the battlefield front face up. So you get Urabrask back, and you get to cast spells from either graveyard, or any graveyard. So you can go ahead and cast your opponent's Go for the Throat, though you're going to need to use some mana from your treasures because you don't get mana fixing here. You're still going to have to pay that black mana for the Go for the Throat or whatever spell the opponent has in their graveyard, so that's why those treasures are very important. But it is also very important that you also get Urabrask back to its front face, so you can go ahead and keep getting that additional mana to keep casting these spells and keep getting that 1 damage whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. So you can go ahead and like play Ancestral Anger for free, essentially, out of your graveyard and draw a card. You can play Thrill of Possibilities, which is 2 mana, exile the top 2 cards, I believe. Or draw the top, discard 1, draw 2. Anyways, that becomes 1 mana because you're effectively generating 1 mana from Urabrask. So I think this card will be super fun to try and like storm off, or just play in a Jeskai Spellslinger, or just get a little extra value in mono red. So I think this card is definitely the best Urabrask we've seen, and definitely one of the most interesting Praetors from the cycle. Lastly, Jin-Gitaxias. Now, Jin-Gitaxias is 5 mana for a 5/5 that has Ward 2. Then, whenever you cast a non-creature spell with mana value 3 or greater, draw a card. So that is Jin-Gitaxias' body on the front side. You get this 5/5 for 5 with Ward 2, so it's kind of hard to remove. Your opponent's going to have to take some time off to remove it if they want to, but I'm kind of thinking that this card is a little bit too slow. You pay 5 mana, you get nothing instantly. 5 mana is quite a lot in standard here. You got like Invoke Despair and a bunch of other cards that seem like you'd more want to be playing or just higher value at the same mana cost. So you don't get anything when you play this, unlike Vorinclex as well, where you get like 2 lands, or Sheoldred, you kill a creature the opponent controls. So Jin-Gitaxias, that is one of the reasons why I've put Jin-Gitaxias at 5th place here, because, well, it's just so expensive. Sure, you get to draw cards, but that's only if you cast spells 3 mana value or greater, so you're incentivized to further increase your curve and slow down your deck, which I think is kind of dangerous here. Then lastly, I think Jin-Gitaxias is quite hard to flip. Sure, you get to draw extra cards, but the restriction for Jin-Gitaxias is you pay 4 mana, and you can only activate this if you have 7 or more cards in hand. So I think this is a little bit steep, or just too slow and expensive for standard here. But if you can flip this, oh my goodness, the Great Synthesis is amazing. So the first chapter, you draw cards equal to the number of cards you have in your hand. You have no maximum hand size as long as you control the Great Synthesis. So this is, what was that land, that dual-faced land that allowed you to draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand? Well, you get that for free. That's 7 mana value spell that you get on chapter 1. Now, the second chapter is return all non-Phyrexian creatures to their owner's hand. So you go ahead, bounce your opponent's board, probably some of your board, but probably not too much of your board because you're playing non-creature spells to draw your cards. And then, third chapter, you may cast any number of spells from your hand without paying their mana cost, exile the Great Synthesis, and then return it to the battlefield. Again, you get Jin-Gitaxias back on the front side, so you're playing a bunch of expensive non-creature spells. Guess what? You get to draw even more cards. So you get a free Omniscience for a turn, which is crazy, so you just kind of dump out your hand and draw an entire new hand. I imagine you could potentially chain through a lot of your deck this way. So this will definitely be a fun challenge to try and flip Jin-Gitaxias and then just kind of combo off on that turn, playing out a bunch of amazing stuff. But I do think Jin is just a little bit too expensive. So quickly going back to the ratings, we have Sheoldred, the True Scriptures as 1, Elesh Norn, the Argent Etchings as 2, Vorinclex, the Great Evolution as 3, Urabrask, the Great Work, as 4, and Jin-Gitaxias, the Great Synthesis, at 5. Now, if you want to know more of my thoughts on the other cards, mythics, rares, uncommons, commons, all the ones that I think that are important in the set, consider subscribing because I'm going to be putting out other videos on top mythics, top rares, top uncommons for me as a Magic Timmy, I guess. And also consider checking out this video here, which is my set review for Martian Machines, where I try and go in super depth, covering the entire set, the themes within the set, the sort of common tribes within the set, as well as some of the big cards that showed up. I go through every mythic, every rare, and all the notable uncommons and commons. So check that out, and have a nice morning, evening, night, afternoon, wherever and whenever you're watching. Ciao.